Perhaps one of the most enduring questions in education is, what is a good teacher? And perhaps one of the most frustrating answers is, it really depends on your perspective. What this means is, if we try and define what a good teacher is, it really depends on the angle that you're coming from. For example, for the practitioner, the teacher who's actually in a school teaching tends to be a highly complex act, and therefore the knowledge and their expertise emerges as a response to that immediate situation, their ability to handle that immediate situation. In contrast to that, we have the policy maker, the person who makes educational policies and the curriculum and things like that. And because they're not in the immediate situation, they tend to generalize across all the situations. So the knowledge that they have about good teaching tends to be very general. In between that, we can see that we have the educational researcher, the person who's studying teaching. And they tend to look at, or in the past, they've tended to view teaching as a complicated activity. And as a complicated activity, they then can sort of begin to break it down and find out what the key essence of good teaching is. And they tend to view knowledge then as very applicable across different situations. Once you find out what that knowledge is, you can apply it and practice it and get better at it. So these are three different perspectives that we see. There are many more perspectives. Now, these sort of the three main ones generate some interesting perspectives on good teaching. For instance, the New Zealand curriculum, in one section of the curriculum, it talks about effective pedagogy, and it lists off what the notions of a good teacher are in terms of the curriculum. But at the same time, the government has the best evidence synthesis, which is a series of studies that try and bring together and synthesize all the research that's done on good teaching. You would think that they would influence each other, and they do to a certain degree, but the language is a little bit different. On the other side here, we've got concepts of learning theory, which also influence how we think about good teaching and whether practitioners are applying modern learning theories. And then we've got the whole field of research on teaching health and PE, that really specific area which is focused on the findings from the health and PE context itself and the type of specific knowledge. So there are a lot of similarities between these perspectives, but we're really focused also on some of the differences. The notion that practitioners tend to experience teaching as a highly complex task. The idea that researchers have tended to see teaching as a complicated task, and policymakers who tend to see it as a very general task and trying to provide guidance to that field. For the rest of this video, I want to focus in on a couple of these different perspectives and look at them in a little bit more depth. For instance, one of the really important groups in teaching is the student. And students have perspectives about what good teachers are. And so in a lot of the research that we've done around with students about what they see as good teaching, they come up with very much the same ideas, and their concepts tend to be oriented around these four ideas. Firstly, they see a good teacher as somebody who's got the ability to relate positively to young people. They see a good teacher as somebody who's got a positive disposition and a positive character, and who's reliable and stable. They tend to see a good teacher as somebody who's firm and well organized. Students don't like disorganized teachers or teachers that let too much go. And they can also spot a teacher that can create effective lessons. Students are very good at knowing who actually assists them to learn and who doesn't. They make that differentiation between a very nice person and a good teacher. So from a student's perspective, this is how they tend to see good teachers. When we look at the curriculum, which gives a slightly different perspective, we can study this and say, right, what does it say about good teaching? And Leon Bernard wrote a very interesting article in 2009 that studied the curriculum in its language, and he identified that there are various ideas about good teaching that were being constructed in that language, and he listed these off. Now, you don't need to know all these different identities of the good teacher, but just know that the the language and the way the curriculum was constructing the idea of a good teacher was very different. All right, if we look at it, as I said before, the curriculum has a section in it called in defining what the effective teacher is. And it basically says students learn best, or the effective teacher is someone whose students learn best when the teacher can create a supportive learning environment, someone who can encourage thought and action, they can enhance the relevance of new learning, they facilitate shared learning, they make connections to prior learning and experience, they provide sufficient opportunities to learn, and they inquire into the teaching and learning relationship. So that's really interesting if you think about how the curriculum has defined the good teacher, and how our students defined a good teacher. So it's slightly different. One of the things also that is defined in the curriculum and is being pushed in New Zealand education is that a good teacher is somebody who's guided by inquiry, the notion of teaching as inquiry. And if we start at the bubble on the top right, you can see this notion of the teaching and learning as being two slightly different concepts, and that recognizes that you can teach and students don't always learn, and students can learn without teaching going on. So the two concepts are a little bit slippery. But a teacher who's involved in inquiry, and actually involved in three different types of inquiry. One is that a learning inquiry, whereas they are reflecting back on their teaching and saying, what did the students learn from my class? They're also involved in a teaching inquiry, which is what strategies will best help my students learn. And then they are also involved in a focusing inquiry, which is more sort of blue skies thinking about what is important given where my students are at. What's really important to teach? So they're always constantly thinking about what is redundant knowledge and what's new knowledge and what they need to put into their teaching. Yet another perspective is that of the New Zealand Teachers Council. The New Zealand Teachers Council register teachers, and it's their job to oversee the professional standards of New Zealand teachers. So they have a pretty good idea of what they expect a good teacher to be. And so, as they say here, any teacher must show that acceptable learning occurs for all students under their responsibility within an environment that affirms the bicultural and multicultural nature of New Zealand. And they say that this is most likely to happen if the teacher demonstrates knowledge of teaching and learning, so they understand the difference between them, they have very good knowledge of the art of teaching. They can promote learning of students through good practice. They work by maintaining relationships of trust, cooperation, and respect for students, whānau, and parents and colleagues. And they demonstrate educational leadership relevant to the level of experience or responsibility being carried out of the teacher or the professional leader. So these four ideas convert to what the New Zealand Teachers Council call the dimensions of teaching. And their dimensions of teaching are things like the teacher is supposed to have professional knowledge, have good professional practice, maintain good professional relationships with students, colleagues, and parents and others, and be professional leaders in the field. Doesn't matter what level you're at, you expect to be a leader. So New Zealand Teachers Council define that in four different ways. The last thing that we look at is the notion of the best evidence synthesis. This is a project, an ongoing project that the government supports, which looks at bringing together all the evidence that we've got about good teaching and synthesizing it in a way that is easily accessible. And there are three key outcomes from which have emerged from this synthesis so far. The first is that the evidence is overwhelming. That is the quality of the teacher. That is the most important influence on students' learning. So if you think about that, that's quite a fundamental thing. You will make a difference to those students' learning. In fact, you're the most important influence on those students' learning. The second outcome from the best evidence synthesis was the notion of diversity, and the need to see diversity is both a normal and an essential part of teaching, and that incorporates many different characteristics and not just the one. And the third outcome from the best evidence synthesis was the identification of 10 characteristics that link to the student outcome. So they identified 10 things that make a difference to student learning, as opposed to maybe the 7 that were in the curriculum. So to go back to where we started off then, what makes a good teacher really depends on your perspective. We have statements about good teaching in the New Zealand curriculum. Parents will have a perspective. There are learning theories that define what good teaching is. Teachers themselves have their own personal theories and skills and knowledge about what makes a good teacher. Students have a perspective on what makes a good teacher. The Teachers' Council, who've registered teachers, will have a perspective on what a good teacher is. The difficulty for you, and perhaps the challenge for you, is to be able to look at the similarities and the differences between these different perspectives and be able to shape your own concept of what you think is a good teacher. So you get a very informed opinion about what a good teacher is.